Germany's defense minister has warned that in an increasingly dangerous world, the German military must become combat ready and quickly. That will require a major overhaul, not only to the Bundeswehr, but also to attitudes in German society. Despite billions of euros promised last year to modernize the armed forces, decades of deliberate underinvestment mean it's still facing shortages in equipment, funding, and men who are willing to fight. This all amid concern that soon Germany might not be able to count on the United States for its defense. On To The Point, we're looking at the state of European security and asking, is Germany fit for combat? Hello and welcome to this edition of To The Point. I'm Claire Richardson in Berlin, and I'm thrilled to welcome our panel of guests this week. We have British journalist and author John Kampfner, Markus Kaim, Senior Fellow with the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and joining us today from France, Ulrike Franke, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Very warm welcome to you all. Ulrike, for decades, Germany has intentionally underinvested in its military. Why do you think we might potentially see a change in this now?
I mean, we are already seeing a change in that 3 days after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, there was this landmark speech by Bundeschancellor, the federal chancellor, Olaf Scholz, announcing, among other things, 100 billion euro being spent in the armed forces and for the equipment of the armed forces. And this money is being spent. I mean, not 100 billion all at the same time, but nevertheless, there are lots of new equipment and things that are being bought. The big question really is this enough? As much as 100 billion sounds, there are already voices that say we need probably double or triple that. And will this lead to, more combat readiness? Is this enough to fight the underinvestment that you mentioned?
And this is a huge question. Markus, Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, has warned that Germans must get used to the idea that war could be looming in Europe and also must be fit for war. How dangerous is the current situation for Germany?
I think he has exaggerated a little bit for political reasons when he made the point that even NATO territory might be concerned or might be affected by a Russian attack. However, regardless of this, I think war has returned to Europe. You can make the point saying war was never away from Europe. We have to remember the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. But major interstate war has returned to Europe and might be some kind of new normal for the years to come. And I think in this regard, he has a valid point.
And in threatening Germany quite directly. John, I want to come to you on that point. Can you tell us a little bit more about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 has changed the security environment in Europe?
Well, I mean, for Germany, the Zeitenwende speech of Olaf Scholz 3 days after Putin's invasion was really, as it was described, it was the turning point. It was the turning point psychologically for Germany and for Germans who had always regarded that the main lesson of the Second World War was not to be involved in military action, to see warfare as a bad in itself, rather than the defense of democracy and values that Germany and allied countries share. And that is a huge, the pacifist movement here was very strong. It is gradually being unpicked. The appointment of Boris Pistorius in military terms was the big game changer that followed months later, because he is the first person really to drive it through. You now have German forces in advanced positions in Lithuania, soon to be in Romania. And it feels very different. Germany has overtaken the UK as Europe's largest arms provider for Ukraine. But just to throw one further thing in for consideration, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is absolutely going to test Western mettle when it comes to Ukraine. You've got a sense that the counteroffensive of Ukraine of Zelensky didn't achieve that much. You have a sort of sense of ennui going into this and of war fatigue in Western Europe going into this winter, this is going to be the biggest test yet.
Now, Ulrike, John has touched on it just a little bit, but can you just remind our viewers, before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what was the general attitude of Germans toward the importance of having a strong military?
Yeah, so John used the term pacifist mindset, which I don't quite agree with. I mean, I've also, I think, used it in the past, but I think pacifism isn't actually the right term to describe the German mindset. I think it was rather, I mean, it was actually quite anti-military. Any topic regarding the military, defense, security was just seen as something we didn't really want to talk about and didn't really need to talk about. So I think what happened was that following the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, Germans really embraced this idea of the end of history, right? Where military might wasn't that relevant anymore. International disputes would be solved through international organizations, international law. The real kind of geopolitical might was more trade focused and economically focused. And so this idea that the world would eventually become, through globalization and thanks to globalization, a more peaceful place, a liberal place, a democratic place, if you like. And so, yeah, anything related to the military was kind of a thing of the past. And I think Germans really felt quite enlightened, if you like, and really felt like, yeah, military issues were something that we didn't really need to think about anymore. Now, this was clearly wrong. And to be honest, I mean, it was always a bit of an illusion, because the reason that this was kind of true for 2 or 3 decades was also because we were under the security umbrella of the United States and NATO, which is something we didn't like to talk about so much. But yeah, this was the general mindset as I've seen it and as I've grown up in it. And so I think now we really have this shock, this realization that what we thought to be true wasn't actually true, or at least has changed. And we need to get used to this new normal where you have geopolitical competition and where military might does play a role, and you might need military capabilities for deterrence or even for actual defense.
Indeed. So as Ulrike has said, everything has changed after February 2022 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As we've heard just days later, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz speaking of a Zeitenwende, a watershed moment or a turning point in history for Germany's defense policy. And with that came a promise to begin modernizing the German armed forces and a one-time fund of 100 billion euros.
The Bundeswehr appears well equipped in this ad. The German army is being massively rearmed again after decades thanks to 100 billion euros in special funds. But it is happening slowly. Soldiers still have shabby accommodations. They still have to borrow and share equipment because there is not enough to outfit the entire army. We are also stocking Ukraine, which is necessary and important. But we can't forget that our soldiers also need tanks, equipment, and so on. German Defense Minister Pistorius says the Bundeswehr will look different in 3 to 5 years. Today, it is already one of the strongest NATO forces in Europe. However, media reports say that Pistorius will have to offer incentives to lure soldiers into Germany's promised 4,000-man combat brigade on NATO's eastern flank in Lithuania. Personnel is a general issue. The number of applicants is shrinking. The Bundeswehr might not grow from around 180,000 to over 200,000 employees by 2031. How well defended is Germany?
Markus, can you help paint that picture for us? How fit is the German military today? Is it combat ready?
No, it is not. And it's nicely illustrated by a quote by a major German general from, I think, the February 24th or 25th, when he was writing on social media, "We stand here naked."
Wow.
And he was making the point that the German armed forces are not ready to respond to the new threat coming from Russia, that the whole development of the last, let's say, 30 years was under different political guidance, pointing into the same direction, less investment, less spending. I mean, the defense budget was shrinking or has shrunk has decreased over the last 30 years. And it does not represent the geopolitical role of Europe. I mean, we are the biggest power in Europe. I mean, not in military terms, but in economic terms. Germany is considered to be the driving force behind European integration and the question of European foreign and security policy. There are tremendous expectations towards Germany, but in military terms, we're not ready to defend ourselves. And I think we can be happy that President Putin has not advanced further, because I have my doubts if it would be the German armed forces would be capable to help Lithuania, to give one example, to help Estonia, and to defend Germany in particular.
And you said there are states within Europe that do expect more from German militarily. Are you referring there to the Baltic states?
Yeah, I mean, that's a clear point. The new strategic concept of NATO has made that the new emphasis, actually the emphasis since 2014, but now it has been emphasized again, is on reassurance for the Central Eastern European states and on deterrence. And this is particularly important for the countries like Poland, like the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, which feel, for understandable reasons, threatened by Russia in a different intensity, in a different way compared to Germany.
Now, Ulrike, one of the issues within the Bundeswehr, we understand, is a shortage of personnel. I want to ask you a little bit about what's behind that, because there was a survey done in Germany earlier this year showing that if Germany were attacked, just 1 in 10 Germans would be ready to take up arms and fight for their country. And that number was even lower, something like just 1 in 20 who would actually put their hand up and volunteer to do so. What do you think is behind that attitude?
Yeah, I think it shows two things. Number one, it shows that we do live in a bit of a post-heroic society where, this idea of taking up arms to defend your country is something that doesn't really resonate with a lot of people. That being said, I think we also need to be careful with these kinds of polls, given that they are hypothetical, and I think the situation would change if there was an actual attack and an actual danger to the German society. Nevertheless, it certainly shows that, well, again, things related to the military, to defense, is just something that we really didn't have to think about. We actually rather rejected. And so I'm not really surprised by the numbers that you quote.
And John, is it surprising to you? I mean, do you think it's a problem, even if those numbers were to increase, should there be an actual attack and this were no longer just hypothetical? Do you think this is a problem for Germany to be able to find people to fight in its military?
Well, I think Ulrike is right that it is a hypothetical, and when it actually would happen, mindsets would change. But I think there's a different way of looking at this. I totally share the analysis of the failures to invest in the military, the underappreciation of military matters, the fact that the Bundeswehr is not remotely combat ready, and it will take time to happen. However, if you look back at when Putin invaded Ukraine, the assumption was he would take Kiev within a few days, he would install a puppet government, and not many people would lift a finger. This was shortly after President Macron had declared NATO brain dead. And there was just an assumption that this was the way it was. This was after Trump and Brexit and many other negative manifestations. So much of that has changed. NATO has been extraordinarily robust and cohesive during this period. The European Union, where having a different function, has been also. NATO has added in Finland and Sweden. And Poland has just has just moved away from populist authoritarianism. There are good things going on as well. And in some respects, what happened in Ukraine, notwithstanding the awfulness of the invasion, has concentrated minds.
I think something a lot of international viewers will be wondering, that we've talked about how this does mark a shift in culture away from Germans being very nervous after the atrocities carried out in Germany's name in World War II, the last time that Germany was fit for war. Do you think that those concerns are fading enough in order to address Germany's military weaknesses, in order to address a changing geopolitical world?
Well, it's just happening slowly, step by step, and things don't happen in a straight line either. And just going back to the Middle East crisis, which everything plays upon itself, and there are always fears of China and Taiwan. The Middle East crisis and the German government's refusal, alongside the US and other governments, to call for a ceasefire is also a sort of sign and it's incredibly contentious and incredibly impassioned. But there is a hardening of German society, a sense that this permanent outsourcing of its defence to the United States and other partners is no longer viable. But this transition period will really take some time.
It will. Markus, I want to come back to Germany's NATO obligations. Do you think it will be able to meet its NATO obligations in its current state?
If you ask the German defense minister, he's quite confident. I'm not. I mean, let's take only one number, the defense budget. There's a commitment since 2014 to spend 2% on defense. Currently, we're at, as far as I know, 1.50, as far as I remember. This is not so obvious given the 100 billion euro special fund you mentioned at the beginning. So investment can happen currently, but I think the crucial question will appear after the special fund is spent in 2027 or 2028, when we arrive again at the same question posed to Germany since 10, 15 years. How much are you going to spend for defense? And I mean, 2% is roughly 80 billion euro. And I could imagine after a possible end of the Ukraine war in whatever form, and that will raise political questions. I mean, after a Russian-Ukrainian peace, I could imagine that the momentum of the Zeitenwende will simply slowly fade away. That's a consciousness that we have to do more for defense, spend more for defense, will simply fade away in the political arena.
That this would just be a blip on the radar.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's address one of the clouds that's been hanging over this whole conversation and take a quick look across the Atlantic to the United States, where, of course, presidential elections coming up in 2024 and Donald Trump, the clear frontrunner among the Republicans. Some recent polls also see him beating Biden in a hypothetical rematch to become president again. And many in Europe fear another Trump presidency will be a devastating blow to its security. For years, there have been voices calling for Europe to be less dependent on the United States.
If French President Emmanuel Macron had his way, Europe would have reduced its dependency upon the US in terms of defense policy long ago. But German-French armament projects, such as the planned air combat system or a new primary battle tank, have been struggling for years. There is also a dispute over the European Sky Shield initiative led by Berlin. To France's displeasure, Germany is purchasing the Israeli-American Arrow 3 missile defense system. There is no acute threat of attack. Arrow 3 is not being procured to protect us from a threat right now, rather in the future, because we see that the dangers have gotten closer and there is an aggressive neighbor in Europe again. That's why Arrow 3 is the right decision at the right time, so that we will be able to defend ourselves here from 2025. 18 EU countries have joined the protective shield, but France is pursuing its own project, together with Italy. Macron says that Europe should not rely too much on the US. Instead, it should create independent systems. Why do we still buy American products so often? Because the US is much more standardized, and their manufacturers receive massive subsidies. But can and should Europe emancipate itself militarily from the US?
Markus, I'm curious to hear your thoughts there. Can and should the Europe try to emancipate itself from the US when it comes to defense policy?
I don't see it, to be honest. I mean, what has been proven by the strong American response to the Russian attack on Ukraine is that without Europe, without the United States, Europe is not defend itself for the foreseeable future. That might change in the next 20, 30, 40 years, but for the time being, I think we are so dependent on the United States. In military terms, I would add in political terms as well, given the political incoherence of the European Union, I think it would be a fatal idea to distance themselves from the United States. And I mean, what would be different, the idea of strategic autonomy of the last couple of years was focusing more to get away from the United States, and now it's about defining an autonomous role in accordance with the United States and in cooperation with the United States.
And Ulrike, I'm curious to get your view there too. Do you share that opinion?
Well, so in my view, the Europeans should absolutely strive to become less dependent on the United States for at least two reasons. Number one, we just heard there might be another Trump presidency. There might be someone else coming to power in the US who doesn't support Europe as much as Biden and previous administrations do. But also, quite honestly, there are 500 million Europeans and 350 million Americans. And I don't see why the US should forever and ever have to guarantee European security and defense. There are, of course, historical reasons for that, and we're very grateful. But I think just logically speaking, eventually Europe should be able to take more care of itself. And this is by no means any kind of anti-Americanism. On the contrary, I think most Americans would also welcome Europe to be able to do more by itself. The problem that I see is right now, I think we're actually kind of seeing the opposite. I think we're seeing an increase in dependence on the United States. And Germany is an interesting example because Germany has been supporting European EU or other, European multilateral efforts to build up security and defense in the past, but, not really wholeheartedly, I'd say. And ever since the Russian invasion and also with the publication of the German National Defense Strategy, you actually see Germany turning more towards NATO and more towards the US, basically saying, this is what we've got and this is what works. And the European idea is all nice and well, but it doesn't work quite yet. And so therefore, we don't put as much effort into it. And so I think this is going the wrong way.
Yeah, John, do you think this is a good idea? Can you just put into plain terms for us what it will mean, given the very realistic possibility that Donald Trump becomes president of the United States again? What will that mean for German defense and for NATO?
If Donald Trump wins the second term, not to be too nihilistic, all bets are off on pretty much everything. All bets are off. And I'm not being deliberately sort of cataclysmic, but it would be potentially a cataclysm for Western liberal democracy, for the future of NATO, for the sustainability of Article 5, the mutual defence agreement, and added with this sort of extreme authoritarian populism, his contempt for democracy, his contempt for electoral results. It's also the unpredictability of it. We remember his flirting with North Korea, which produced no discernible gains, and nobody knew quite why he was doing it. It is still a mystery. So this is the absolutely very, very black cloud that is hanging over Europe. The Biden administration has invested a huge amount politically in its relationship with Europe, and particularly its relationship with Germany. Behind the scenes, it often expresses frustrations at the point about Germany being incredibly slow to get to 2%, not the only country, but it is the trendsetter and the most important country, and its failure to get there is a problem. But the Americans are trying to bring sort of to nudge the Germans in the right direction. And the answer is seemingly clear. Were there to be a non-Trumpian administration, don't forget Barack Obama was frustrated with Europe, and he was talking about the Indo-Pacific tilt and about a reprioritization of American foreign policy long before Trump. So this sense of Europe having to step up predates Trump. But as I say, it will be a completely different environment if Trump wins.
Now, Markus, it is clear that Germany certainly benefits from U.S. support. But does the relationship go the other way, too? I want to just make clear, what does Washington get out of having an ongoing strong partnership with Germany through the NATO alliance?
I think we're going back. It goes back to the assumption of basically all U.S. presidents in their Euro policy since the last 70 years. Even the United States, as a major power, needs instruments to implement its power, and these kind of instruments are alliances and partners. We have them for the Asia-Pacific with a special relationship with Korea and Japan, with the new formed alliances with Australia, New Zealand, with the Quad format, bringing India into the ring. And for Europe, for the Euro-Atlantic area, we have the traditional NATO format. So that adds momentum to U.S. foreign policy, adds weight to U.S. foreign policy, not to mention all the operational advantages to have U.S. bases on European soil, which makes life for the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and military policy in the Middle East easier.
And Ulrike, we'll give you the last word just briefly. If you were advising German policymakers on how to go about becoming more independent from the U.S. in terms of Germany's defense needs, what concrete recommendations would you make?
So there are many things I think that Germany needs to do right now. It has to do with funding and financing. We need to not only reach the 2%, as it was said, but reach it reliably. It is still not entirely sure how we're going to do this once the special fund runs out. We need to have a societal debate on all things military and security, and I really am looking for political guidance on this. This isn't just happening, like this. It really needs to be driven by the political realm, and we do need reforms in the kind of MOD and how the Bundeswehr works, which is something that is being started right now, but needs to be driven through even more.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Thank you to everybody watching at home. That is our show for today. We hope you enjoyed this edition of To The Point. I want to thank our guests for their insights, and thank you for watching. Let us know what you thought. If you're on YouTube, you can drop us a note in the comments. I'm Claire Richardson in Berlin. Many thanks once again.